I'd like to welcome you all to the discussion right now, Women Transforming Cities. And just because there was a little confusion in the flyer, Women Transforming Cities is actually an organization, womentransformingcities.org on your website, designing ideal cities for women and girls. And we started this organization about 3 years ago with a launch in the Vancouver City Council chambers. And since then, we've gone on to host cafes in neighborhoods across the Lower Mainland on topics such as leadership, affordable housing, youth, and all kinds of ongoing issues. And we'll be doing one on the $10 childcare campaign. We're talking about doing a women's bike ride. We had a Pecha Kucha in the Vogue Theatre, sold out the Vogue Theatre, which is about 1,200 people capacity with lineups down Granville Street. And we're hosting a conference in the Seagull Business Center the day before FCM on May the 30th. And we hope you'll join us on that, and you can sign up online. We're bringing in Sylvia Bashiva, Prabha Khosla, we've got Carolyn Andrews coming. We've Karen Legovici is going to speak at some point during the event. We've got all kinds of interesting people coming and attending. So we're really concerned. We've seen, and my name's Ellen Woodsworth. I was a former Vancouver City Councillor for 6 years, and we've been working on this idea for quite a few years, but it's really taken off, and it's going gangbusters all over the place, and we hope you'll join us and maybe set up a group in whatever area you're from. We're starting to have this discussion with some dynamite speakers, but I'd like to acknowledge the Stolo people whose land we're on right now, unceded territory. And when we talk about designing ideal cities for women and girls, we're talking about things like violence against women and girls, and particularly like to acknowledge the murdered and missing women in the downtown east side of Vancouver that very much motivate me as I work on this issue. We're talking about issues like childcare, housing, leadership, income equity, and we're talking about getting women to run for public office. And as most of you know, only 22% of electeds at the municipal level are women, and only 16% of mayors. We used to be a #1 country in the world for women, and we've fallen back significantly. And at the city level, we know that it's a place that women are often very active doing volunteer work, but we're not integrated into the policies, programs, and fundings that cities are involved in. And as a recent, I was on a panel very recently in which we talked about emergency response and the fact that in Fukushima, many women died because women's unpaid work is invisible. And so the women were staying behind, looking for the children, looking for the elders, and nobody even knew that they weren't there and they were missing. So as one example, but we've got some amazing, amazing speakers coming up, and I was told, don't read out their bios. Everybody can read them in the flyers, so I won't. But I'd like to give the mic first to Jessie and have her bring a greeting from First Nations.
Gela Kisla. Liku am glaso lilaugua. Kan na hotel, Louis-Liquislau, Unity, Gela Kisla Chehalas. Thank you. My name is Claudia Laugua, or Bridge Between the Worlds, as I mentioned yesterday. And so, again, today I'm excited to bridge between my experiences as a First Nations woman in a small rural town, not a city, and bring some of those experiences here to you. I'm Jessie Hemphill, so I'm from the small town of Port Hardy on the north end of Vancouver Island. I was born and raised there, and I come from the Wasanapo Nations there, as well as Louis-Liquislau and Métis. And in 2011, I had the pleasure of being elected to City Council for the town of Port Hardy. So I sort of serve a dual role as a member of the First Nation, but also a city councilor, the first First Nations councillor from a local First Nation ever elected to Port Hardy Council, and the youngest woman ever. So I'm really pleased to be here today. And when I was pondering this topic of women transforming cities, it really got me thinking more along the lines of how has my town, my community, transformed me to be able to come forward and be a leader in a lot of different situations, wearing a lot of different hats. So I thought that maybe an interesting thing I could do was just share with you some of the things that have have helped me get to this place of being a recognized leader. And I have to say, it's really interesting, coming from a First Nation and going out into First Nations communities, you get credibility if you grew up in the res, right? If you don't have that on your CV, then you kind of lose a bit of credibility. But as just a person in non-First Nation society, I am amazed at the level of credibility that being a counselor gets me. And I've actually had people go from thinking that I was a thief because my car's pretty beat up, to all of a sudden treating me like a peer because they find out I'm on council like that. So, if you're First Nations, I grew up on the res, so I have some credibility there, but I'm also on council, so, maybe there's a little bit of knowledge behind this. It's just been a really interesting phenomenon. So, it's interesting. I know a lot of women feel disenfranchised until we get into positions of leadership and have an authoritative voice on a decision-making body. But I have to say that has never really been my experience. And so, when I think about cities transforming women, it's been a lifelong process for me to get to this place of grooming. We have this, in our First Nations culture historically where leaders are groomed from the time they're small children. And so, when I think about the things that I can do to groom other women, from the time I was a child, my mom, who was working in a lot of self-government and in a lot of decision-making bodies and with really powerful people, had me and my sister and my brother when she was a professional woman, and she had no qualms about bringing us along to events like this, workshops, large meetings, parking us in the back with some paper and pencils, and letting us be there to soak it in. And so I think, that was part of the beginning of Cities Transforming Women, is allowing children and babies to take part in these things so that they're not just the domain of the elders that have the authoritative voice. As I got older, when I was in elementary school, again, I was groomed into these positions of leadership, and so our school actively promoted public speaking and volunteerism. And so from the time I was a small child, I was given ample opportunities to get in front of large groups of people and speak. And I think one example that stands out is we had a celebration of the sea at the big house up in Fort Rupert, and there was about 500 people there, academics and First Nations and people, musicians, artists speaking about the sea. And before we left to go out the door, I was 5 years old, I asked my parents what it was about, and they said, it's a celebration of the sea, and there's going to be people singing and talking. I thought, singing, well, if we're going, I've been taught that you should contribute, so I'm going to write a song. Maybe they'll let me sing it. And so I wrote a song called Whales Ride the Sea, Just You and Me, so beautiful, so beautiful, so beautiful. And I got there and I thought, well, okay, they're going to give me time to sing this song. And even though I was this precocious 5-year-old, they did give me the time to sing my song after tying on a couple of coat hems or whatever. And I was allowed to get up there in front of 500 people and sing this song with the band backing me, which was amazing. And so I think that's another example of cities transforming women. Right there, you're building a confidence and a sense of connectedness and like, I am someone, as the Mayor Chilliwack, I think, was talking about yesterday, I'm someone and I have a voice that's important. As I got older into high school, I was given a lot of opportunities to be a leader again on youth issues, and was the chair of the Provincial Youth Tobacco Attack Team for a couple of years, lots of stuff like that. And our service clubs began to recognize the work that was happening. So the first 2 years that our Rotary Club offered the Service Above Self award in our community, I was awarded that award for volunteer work. So again, there was that recognition of participation in community. And so all this was grooming. And then of course there's the family input, right? So I am lucky to have 3 grandmothers. And so my grandma Jean taught me great manners and civic involvement. When she was in her 70s, she was doing in-home support care for 65-year-olds. So there's a long history there of involvement, and she got me the Ladies Auxiliary when I was a young teenager. My grandma Lucy, my First Nations grandma, taught me the importance of culture and language and family, and I studied very closely with her when I was doing my linguistics degree. And then my Granny Marion taught me the importance of not taking yourself too seriously in life, and she also taught me a lot of great dirty jokes, which I really appreciate. So they've all played an important role, in just demonstrating, the values that you need to hold no matter what level of authority you have. This topic of women transforming cities is kind of interesting to me because I've never felt disenfranchised just because I was a woman. And I think it's kind of funny. So when the 2011 election came along, we're really lucky in Port Hardy that we have a female mayor, Bev Parnham, who's awesome. And we have, besides myself, 2 other women councillors. So we actually have 4 women and 3 men on our council. But how I ran for council was our female mayor took my husband aside, who was new to the town, said, "You're doing a lot of neat stuff with youth. You should really run for council." So my husband thought, "Okay, I'll do this. I'm pretty new to the city." So he came home and told me he was going to do this, and I thought, you're probably going to be bored in a lot of these meetings and things by yourself, and you're going to be doing all these signs, so I may as well run with you since I've been kind of thinking about it. So I thought, okay. And but really, it was Russ Helberg, who's a little bit infamous for being one of the 2 people in BC to support Enbridge. I don't know, there was news articles going along about the evil Russ Helberg. He's very right-wing, really involved in Legion and 101 Squadron, but he's an awesome guy, and he really pushed me, even though he's right-wing and I'm definitely not. He really spent a lot of time encouraging me and coaching me to run for council. So I think, I think there's going to be some talk about mentoring, but I'm really appreciative that it was this older, white, right-wing guy who mentored me into running for council. And unfortunately, my husband didn't get in, and I did. It's not a sore spot, and he's very supportive, so that was great. And, I hope that what I'm sharing with you is that in order for women to transform cities, cities have to transform women by this mentoring and this inclusion. And it's not just women that can mentor and transform women, but men, all ages. Everybody has a role in just mentoring leaders, right? We all have a role in mentoring leaders to come forward and take up the reins from people that have done this important work before us. And I am so grateful to all of those that have played that role in my life. And now I'm so pleased to have the honor to go out into situations like this and hopefully offer encouragement to women and boys, that are coming up to also take on these positions of leadership. So we'll look forward to your questions, and thanks for listening to my sort of rambly stories here. Thanks.
I guess I'll go next. I'm Ben Henderson. I'm a councillor in the city of Edmonton. The irony of me speaking about women transforming cities is not eluding me. But there may be actually some interest in that as well, because I'm mostly here to talk about a program that the City of Edmonton did in terms of mentoring young women. And I can also speak a little bit about the FCM program, which I also know something about, and there was a link between those 2 things. But I thought I would just start really quickly by telling my first impression in terms of me coming as a man to City Council 5 years ago, and coming out of a business. I was in theater before that, and coming out of a business that is pretty well even in terms of who's sitting at the table in decision making. There's ghettos in the arts, obviously for women, so it's certainly not perfect, but it was really weird for me to suddenly find myself sitting at tables again that were all men. It just felt really odd. And clearly there are some systemic barriers that are still there that are stopping even getting to any kind of commonality of voice. So that having been said, to talk a little bit about the FCM program first, and there's a larger program. It's called Getting to 30, and it's based on the premise that if you're going to have a truly representative council or any level of government, you need at least 30% of both genders. So that goes both ways. I mean, the theory is, and there are actually happening now a few councils across the country, I think, that are all women or significant majority women. And I think, I don't think we need to worry about them yet, but ultimately, hopefully you get to the point where you want to make sure that both genders are represented minimum 30% on any future council, and that's when we know we will be successful. So, there's more programs behind the FCM piece, but I'm going to speak specifically about the mentorship piece. It came originally to give credit out of City of Toronto, and I think mostly Pam McConnell drove it forward there, and they had put a mentorship program in place. I think they're probably in year 4, 5, or 6 now. Karen Leibovicci, who's president of FCM, and I, who both sit on Edmonton Council, knew about that and thought it would be very interesting to do something for our council. Happily, no one paid very much attention to us because I'm not sure there was the same drive in the first instance from all of our colleagues. But the administration were very interested in it, and the administration went and looked at the particularly women. I think in the clerk's office actually drove a lot of it forward, and were able to bring us a report back fairly easily on how Toronto had done it, how we could do it, and were able to find a little pocket of money within their own budget to do it. So it was a kind of easy thing to move through our council, and some of the skeptics sort of went, well, why not? What harm could it do? And let us move ahead with it. And around the same time as we were putting that together, FCM was also looking at taking the Toronto program and turning it into what they're calling the protege program. And there was a bit of money that had come forward to actually look across the country at supporting 4 different communities as a kind of pilot project to expand on what Toronto had done. The 4 communities, Edmonton ended up being one of them as a big city. Thompson, Manitoba was another one because they wanted a northern community, and particularly one that had a strong Aboriginal community. Quebec City, I think, was the 3rd one because that gave them a francophone one, and also a community that had a party system in place. And then the 3rd one was this is one I can remember. Wainfleet, Ontario, which was a small rural community, although I think it was also fairly close to a major center. So they basically did one in each, and one of the things it allowed us to do in our first year was get some resources from FCM for some of the bigger pieces of the puzzle that we probably wouldn't have necessarily put in place ourselves in the first instance. So some of the workshops that we did for our mentees, FCM supported in the first year, we picked them up now that we continued ourselves to do them. But workshops on campaign, college media training, those kind of things, FCM was able to provide for all of us in the first year of doing it. So we went out and we advertised pretty broadly. We got 6 counselors to agree to be mentors in the first instance, in the first year. All 4 women on our council. So our council is actually above 30% right now and has been for quite some time. So all 4 women engaged, 2 of the men. Interestingly enough, and I think this is one of the learnings in the second year, and this is why it's sort of a message out to the men out there, is that there were a couple of other men on our council who ultimately became interested in doing it. Probably would have been interested in doing it the first year, but assumed that because they were men, they couldn't mentor young women. And I would argue that that's something we're going to have to get over, specifically if you have councils in place right now, which are largely men. If you're expecting the women to be the mentors, just women to be the mentors, you're not going to get as far as you could if you involve the men. So there's obviously things as a mentor that I can't bring to the table in quite the same way that my female colleagues can, but at least I can bring something to the table so we could get more women into the program. Because we were seriously oversubscribed in the first year. We had 15 applicants and only 6 of us were able to take mentors, and they were all good applicants. In the second year, we had 8, we were up to 8 counselors, and we had 19 applicants. So we're still not getting enough counselors to take in the kind of interest we're getting back from the young women that are wanting to do this. So I think the men do have to step up, or you're just not going to be able to sort of follow through. So we have a pretty comprehensive program. Obviously, the way we've ended up working, I can talk a little bit about later, maybe in questions if people want to know more about this. But we take in the young women apply. And they, because I'm running out of time, the young women apply. They can state a preference if there's a counselor they want to work with, or they don't have to. And then we chose to look at the resumes and decide who we were then interested in interviewing. And we did that sort of collectively around the table to make sure that somebody good didn't accidentally get missed or lost. And then sat down and kind of did a very informal interview with young women who were applying, to see if it was a good fit. And I think that's one of the really important pieces of the puzzle, is you want, if it's really going to work, it's got to be someone that you have some kind of simpatico with both ways. And the best way to do that is to sit down and meet. And if you I would argue that if you let someone else do the match, and I know I actually I had done a mentorship with Equal Voice and had a very happy match there. But I can't imagine what it'd be like to mentor if it was someone that you just weren't in line with, if your interest didn't align, if your sympathies didn't align. So we do the selection that way, and then once the selection's done, we each sit down with the person who ends up being chosen and figure out where they want to go, what they're interested in doing. A lot of it's kind of job shadowing, but also job shadowing with an ability to say, this is what's happened, this is what it's all about. So you can very much tailor it to their energies. and what they're interested in doing. I've been able to get, because of the specific interests of the couple of people that I've mentioned, I've been able to get them into a level of meeting just to sort of sit there and listen they would never be able to get into otherwise. A lot of times it will tie into work that they're doing and interests that they have that may actually not necessarily be connected to whether or not they're going to run for council. Because I think the other important thing to remember about this is if you focus just on getting people to run, it's probably a little bit narrow. In my mind, it's about encouraging young women and training them to think about themselves as leaders and moving into leadership positions. And how they decide to go into that leadership position, I think they're not going to know maybe for 2 or 3 or 4 years. But we also do, and this is something that Equal Voice couldn't put on the table, that Equal Voice is a national organization that has been working on the question of getting women into political office for, I don't know, it's been around for quite some time.
Probably 6 years.
Yeah, well, I think it's longer than 6 years anyway. But it's less formal. It's more about collecting the names of women who are interested, and then collecting name mentors and putting them together and seeing what happens. And yeah, there's a lot more stuff in Equal. I can't remember all of it. So anyway, where were that? So the other thing that we've done, and the mentorship that I've done with the Equal Voice piece didn't do this, was the kind of group sessions that were able to be organized for the mentees. So again, a day-long session with someone on media and communication, with a media specialist. A day-long session with actually this FCM did it for us in the first year and last year. This year we did it with a former city councillor who came in and talked about campaigning and what campaigns were all about. One on governance, one on the city, this is an interesting one on our boards and committees and things that we're always looking for volunteers to go on to, because one of the ways we can get them engaged in the system is then encouraging them to get onto some of those volunteer boards and committees. So we do a session on that. And my mentee from the Equal Voice was very jealous of that and ended up sitting in on all those sessions. And I think it's also a really good session, really good way for them to be able to share notes with themselves and share experience with themselves, so the mentees all get to spend time together as a group without us necessarily being there. It's been, the one story, because I'm going to run out of time, just this kind of anecdotal story. The young woman that I had last year really came in. She was a social worker within the city of Edmonton. She was going, well, I'm sort of interested, but I'm not sure I'm interested in political office. And by the time she left, she was going, I can do this. Not only can I do this, but I'm interested in doing this. And I think that was as much a surprise, because I didn't push her in that direction. I said, no, that's fine. I sort of said that this is about leadership, and if you're going to move up within the city administration, that's cool as well. But I think in part, and I laugh at this, I think in part it was a realization of, hey, if he can do it, it's really not that hard. But it was about a demystification, I think, of the job, and that you don't have to have any special training or any special skills, that it's not as intimidating as one imagines it to be when you're on the outside of it. I think that really helped lift the veil. And also, I think, an interest in and a confidence that built in her. So we threw her in at the deep end, and I think it was a changing experience for her. That the minister came out in the middle of this. Rona Ambrose came out because she has been quite supportive of the whole program to FCM. I have other questions about her in other ways, but I will support her on this one. She came in and almost noticed that, okay, I'm making this announcement, I'd like one of the mentees to speak. So Kaylin was thrown in literally the deep end, didn't have time to think about it, didn't have time, and I was thrown in as well. I had to speak at it too, and she sort of said, what do we do? I said, just go up and do whatever, don't think about it, just go do it. And she was terrified and was fabulous, got all sorts of media press out of it, and has never looked back. It was a confidence kind of changing moment for her. And I think again, it was the demystification of it, the fact that, hey, I can do this. And I think it's been a great way to, with these particular women, to get rid of whatever barrier is getting in the way, that I think is as much about them going, I don't think I can do this, and convincing them they actually can and making it possible. So it's been successful. It's little baby steps. I'm pretty sure ultimately most of them will run. Some of them are going to run in this election. They may not win this time, but maybe next time before they win. but they're early in their careers, and I think the payoff can be huge. Just real fast, you can get to Women in Local Government through fcm.ca. You can get to this guide, which is for the protege program. And it's basically a how-to guide for how to do all of this that came out of the pilot study. And through edmonton.ca/mentorship, opening the potential for mentoring is basically all of our stuff. So people want to have a look through these copies. I don't need to keep them. I only have one each, but they're all available online. And I was tempted to do the PowerPoint thing just to give you the email addresses, but I continued PowerPointless.
I apologize, the mic is my fault. I'm Tiffany Muller-Myrdahl. I'm a Junior Ruth Wynn Woodward Chair in Gender and Urban Studies at Simon Fraser University. And I had the flu in February and I have been left with this. So I hope it's turned to sexy radio voice at this point. But I will try to keep my comments somewhat brief, although I am the academic, so I have written out. So I want to just make 4 points today. The first is, I think, the most basic, which is that when we talk about women, we're talking about a full diversity of women. Feminism, I think for many people, is still marked as a movement that sought to address the needs of white middle-class women. And I understand the history of those critiques, but that was never my feminism. So for me, feminism is about addressing power and privilege and the ways that people are marginalized across categories of difference, whether that's disability or gender, the ways that we're racialized, all kinds of things. So we always need to be thoughtful about intersectional lenses of gender. Similarly, when we use gender, we need to be careful not to substitute it for women. So gender, of course, refers to the norms and expectations and performances that come to be associated with how we do this thing called femininity and masculinity. And those are context specific and they change over time. So when we use gender, we're referring to the ways that masculinity and femininity get normalized and standardized. And what that means in terms of looking at cities is that when we talk about the ways that planning processes, for example, are gendered, that's about how knowledge is being produced and circulated in particular ways, or how expertise and authority is framed and embodied, or whose experiences are valued and welcomed. And that's similar to, but still distinct from, talking about whether or not women are involved in the planning process. So, right, we're thinking about both women and men and how those processes of policy making and planning are sort of masculinized or not, right? Whose authority, how is authority created? So gender lenses and equity lenses are tools that municipal governments and NGOs and corporate sector have at their disposal to think about how power is embodied and whose voices are valued, as Melissa talked about in the keynote. And these lenses can help us examine service provision, they can help us examine the design of policies and programs, and the ways in which systemic barriers and inequities have shaped existing relationships. So ideally, these lenses complement other types of lenses that we've heard about over the weekend, like examinations of community resilience. And I think they're useful to look at both micro and macro processes and systems. So in terms of micro processes, I'm thinking about service provision, street lighting at the block level, separated bike lanes that make it safer for children and families to use bike lanes, or at least provide this sense of comfort in a different way. The timing of pedestrian lights that make it possible for less mobile people to safely cross the street. Those are sort of micro processes and policies. By macro, I'm talking about analysis of the system of policymaking as a whole. So who's at the table, right? Whose voices are being sought out to make policy and planning decisions? Is on the ground and experiential and embodied knowledge of how the city works and for whom. Are those voices valued? Are there voices at the table who can speak to what it means to be racialized or gendered in particular ways and how that translates to daily experience in everyday life? So gender and equity lenses can be incorporated into municipal governance by creating bureaucratic mechanisms. And these are meant, I think, to both shift the frame of reference, the modus operandi that people use when creating and implementing policy. But it also helps to create a culture of compliance that ensures that previously underserved populations have their needs met. So we can look at the city of Ottawa for an example of this. The city worked with the NGO, City for All Women Initiative, to create a freely available guide that helps city staff to use an equity lens. Gender budgeting is another example of deploying a gender lens within a specific policy framework. We can also think about gender and equity lenses in terms of analyses that emerge through consultative processes that are conducted by municipalities or cities in partnerships with NGOs or NGOs themselves. So Together for Women's Safety was published in 2010 by Women in Cities International, we see Femmeville, which documents safety audits conducted by Aboriginal women in Regina, elderly women in Gatineau, immigrant and visible minority women in Peel, and women with disabilities in Montreal. So these are reports that have produced rich resources that cities can use, but cities can also learn from the processes and partnerships that research can emerge from. So the last couple points I want to make are a bit more sort of theoretical, and one of them is just to recognize that there's a formidable gap, I think, between the messiness of everyday life and the quantifiable outcomes and product delivery and tick boxes that we know in the world of policy development and implementation. There's I know we all could speak to like the billion reasons that this gap exists. And it's about, bureaucracy tends to encourage stasis rather than change, and programming tends to exceed any capacity for evaluation and measurement. I think the outcome of this, so the upshot is really the important bit, which is that the culture of policymaking tends to leave under-theorized the systemic violence that the policies and programs were created to address, right? So I think one of the ways to kind of shift our framework and really try to bring the messiness of everyday life in to policymaking is to echo Betty Baxter's comments this morning on emphasizing process. So I'm a real proponent of participatory budgeting as an example of this kind of process. Active transportation is another initiative where I think this shift is underway to move from sort of quantifiability to process and bring those two things more into conversation. So I think in some ways these examples conform to what we think of as typical participatory processes, but typical participatory processes have come under fire for doing some of the things that Melissa was speaking to, which are sort of incorporating rather than empowering participants, or trying to generate consensus around an already agreed upon agenda. I think that's where participatory budgeting and active transportation actually do a different kind of participation, because there are checks and balances in place, as she was speaking to, but there isn't a pre-existing agenda that exists where that may be the case in sort of what we think of as regular participatory processes. We also, I think, need to be creative in terms of the kind of participation we're doing, and Women Transforming Cities is one of those ways of being creative to try and intervene in policymaking by creating forums for those who have traditionally been left out of policy and planning circles, to leverage their own expertise into solutions that will make cities work for everyone. So my final point is about the stories that we tell and the way that we're encouraged often, I think, to think about and to articulate business as usual. So I argue, and this is not just me, but a number of scholars talk about the way that stories are performative, the way that they do the work of encouraging us to imagine different kinds of futures. And so the stories can reinforce hegemonic discourses, or they can provide an alternative imaginary about the city. So I want to encourage us to think, to imagine different futures, to imagine cities that will work for everyone. And just to cite an example that was written by the Toronto Women's City Alliance a couple of years ago. They wrote a very long and beautiful sort of description of what an ideal city would look like that would work for women. And just to quote a couple of bits from that, they say, on any given day, she knows there are advocates in her community who are committed to supporting her. And advocacy in the city is intertwined with leadership and civic engagement. So women's voices are not only heard, but they are represented by women in positions as elected officials and board members and civil service employees and more. She lives a healthy life in a healthy community where gender equity plays a primary role in how a city is viewed and managed. After all, this is a city where 52% of the population is reflected in governance. So I think we need to take responsibility for the ways that we are co-implicated in the process of changing ourselves and our stories, changing our thinking, changing our cities, and changing the world.